This is the Chapter 7 overview, and this chapter focuses on migration and immigration. And migration is when people living in a place see people coming in. Oh, sorry, that's considered to be immigration. Migration is when people who are leaving a country, the people who are staying, see that as migration. They're going somewhere else. And so this is included as a social problem, um, not because it's an issue here for the United States, but it also around the world is an issue. And so we'll look at some of the reasons why it has become a bigger issue, perhaps than it has been in the last 150 years. So first off, it's important to recognize that immigrating from one place, leaving your home country and going to another place, that is not easy. It is not easy. It's a very difficult decision. And of course, depending upon the country you're leaving and the country where you are trying to go, it may be very difficult to do so legally. And it may be a very challenging process, particularly since many people who migrate out of their countries and go to another country don't have the funds to pay for a lawyer who will help them navigate the immigration process in the country where they're going. And so it's not always either. It's not always the choice of the person who is leaving their country. Let's see, internal migration, that's when people are moving around within a country, and we saw some of that during the early stages, the early months of COVID-19 in 2020. It appeared that many people who were living in cities began to move to suburbs or even to another state because they could now work remotely and they didn't have to go into the city every day, or if they were living in the city, they didn't have to go to the office every day. I've already covered immigration. It's when people in a country see people coming in, they call that immigration. Migration, people in a country see people leaving. And so immigration is one that happens. So with immigration, we typically think of it as mass numbers of people moving from one place to another. And of course, what we have seen over the history of humans is that sometimes people leave areas and en masse go to other areas, that is that emigration, because of a social problem that is existing in their home country. So for example, in the early 1800s, there were many people from Ireland who immigrated into the United States because there was a famine going on in Ireland. And so, if there's not any food, very difficult to get food, the choice isn't necessarily one that you want to make, but if it's between leaving your home country and going to a country where food is more plentiful, you may very well do that for yourself and your family. And then here's just a chart. You can take a look at this more when you have more time. It's also in the textbook, looking at just the different migration patterns of human populations since 1500. Here is, please read about that in the text. I want to focus on what seems to be an important piece of immigrating to a new country. And that is the difference between assimilation and acculturation. Assimilation is that old idea that that people come to the United States and they learn the customs, they learn the traditions, they become fully American, they learn the language, etc. So that's this idea of assimilation, coming into this, quote, melting pot. Acculturation is a term that was created by the early 1970s, when there were some people, particularly academics, social scientists, political scientists, who recognized that to be an American in the United States didn't necessarily mean you had to give up everything about your prior identity. Acculturation is this idea that you maintain the culture that you came with to the United States, but you incorporate American culture as well. And I argue, this is my argument, that that is better for a couple reasons. One, it means that people can remain true to their identities while also taking on a new identity as, quote, an American. But also consider all the cool food we get, all the cool other cultures that we've been exposed to over the last 45, 50 years in the United States. When I was a kid, no one but Mexicans ate Mexican food. And now there's so much pseudo-Mexican food out there, it's hard to keep track. There's Chipotle and Qdoba and Del Taco and Taco Bell and, all these pseudo-Mexican foods out there. And while, I'm not a big fan of those, people now don't look at a burrito as being a weird thing. And of course, behavioral assimilation is when a person begins to act like people in the country that they've migrated to. Structural assimilation is when you become involved in the social institutions within the society. So going to school, that's part of structural assimilation. Getting a job, another part of structural assimilation. Registering to vote once you get citizenship, another part of structural assimilation. Marital assimilation is, of course, when an immigrant marries somebody who is, quote, a U.S. citizen, somebody who's been living here for a while. That's marital assimilation. And then identificational assimilation is when a person begins to think of themselves as American rather than their old identity. So various levels of assimilation. I want to focus on something that I mentioned when I began, and that is that migrating, leaving your home country and going to another country is not an easy decision. We shouldn't think that people come to the United States or any other country because it's, they just woke up one morning, a wild hair up their butts and said, hey, let's migrate to the United States. That's not how it happens. There are what sociologists call push-pull factors, meaning that there are push reasons, push factors. These are factors that would tend to push someone toward the decision of migrating, leaving their home country and going to another country. Things such as, a famine, or there's civil unrest, or there's persecution, that the individual maybe is being persecuted, either religious persecution, political persecution, it might be extreme poverty. These are push factors, things that the person is experiencing that would tend to push that person toward the decision to leave their home country. Pull factors are things that would tend to keep you in your home country. So, for example, not wanting to be away from family members, particularly one's quote, nuclear family or closest family members, perhaps not wanting to have to learn a new language, perhaps not wanting to learn how to navigate a whole new society and a new system, a new way of doing things. Those would be pull factors, things that would tend to keep you where you are. Maybe even simply a love of one's country, and a thought that maybe if I stay, I can help make this country better. So there are different factors, both push and pull factors, that people consider when they're making a decision to leave. Again, making a decision to leave is generally not at least for most people, something in which they wake up one morning and decide, okay, yep, let's go, take off. That generally doesn't happen. And of course, there can be obstacles once they make the decision. Maybe family members try to change their minds. Maybe they need money to buy, a ticket for a ferry, or in the case of some people who cross from Central America and Mexico into the U.S., maybe you need money to hire coyote. Can be intervening obstacles as well. Maybe you get sick and you can't make the journey. There are a lot of different things that or factors that influence whether someone makes the decision and actually carries through with that decision to leave their home country. All right, so there's more discussion there. All right, so let's focus a little bit on dissonant acculturation, consonant acculturation, and selective acculturation. Remember, I said that acculturation is about maintaining your home or ethnic identity and integrating the American culture as well. So dissonant acculturation is something that can destabilize an immigrant family, and this unfortunately happens fairly frequently. It essentially is referring to when a child adopts American culture much more quickly than their parents do. And so the immigrant parents don't understand why the child who's assimilated or who's acculturated very quickly, has learned the language, is going to school, has made friends, now wants to do all the things that American kids do, but perhaps to those ethnic parents, those are not things that they're used to allowing their child to do. And so that dissonant acculturation might destabilize the family, because now the parents may have difficulty, I don't want to say controlling their child, but understanding their child, and having the ability to maintain some sort of order within the family, because now the child is stepping out and trying to do things that the parents are not okay with. Consonant acculturation. This happens when both the parents and the children are acculturating, that is, integrating American culture at about the same rate. So they're both the parents and the children, they're learning English. The children are going to school. The parents are maybe taking some courses at a community college. They're at about the same rate integrating the American culture. That enables parents to understand what their children are going through, what they're learning, and it also means then the parents, because they understand more of what the child wants to do and what the child is learning, they can have a better sense of, again, not the best word, but control over their children. Selective acculturation is when parents decide, these are some of the parts of American culture we want our children to adopt, to integrate, and yet there are other parts that we don't want them to integrate. And so it's called selective acculturation, because the parents are really trying to decide, what parts of American culture do I think are positive and I want my children to embrace as well as myself, and which are negative and I don't want them to embrace. Again, really very quickly here, when there's consonant acculturation, remember that's when the parents and the children are integrating American culture at about the same rate, there's likely to be upward trajectory for the family, meaning the family will tend to be able to live within American society fairly easily, fairly well, and have some degree of success within American society. Dissonant acculturation often leads to downward trajectory, meaning that because the parents and the children are on such different pages in terms of integrating American culture, the family unit begins to fall apart. And the children may get involved in some things that are quite negative, maybe even get caught up in the juvenile justice system, and the parents are at a loss to understand how to help their children. Selective acculturation also tends to lead to upward social mobility because parents, again, they have some degree of control of how much and what parts of American culture are embraced by the family, and again, some degree of control over how quickly the culture is adopted. Of course, some of the issues affecting immigrants, we know discrimination, that's a huge social problem for immigrants. We seem to be a country that has forgotten that, with the exception of indigenous peoples who are already here on this continent, Native Americans and indigenous Mexicans, people who are descended from those two groups, everyone else is an immigrant. Okay, and so many people in this society seem to have forgotten that this is largely a nation of immigrants. When I was a kid growing up, Latinx people of Mexican ancestry were fond of saying, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And in my own case, that is really quite true. On my mother's side, my mother is a Yaqui Indian. She was born on the Mexican, what was currently the Mexican side. But there are also Yaquis in Arizona, down around Tucson. There's a reservation there. And so when I have been there and talked to people there and mentioned that my mom was Mexican Yaqui, they've said, you know what, we're all one people. The border is what separated our people. That's what separated us. We are one people. And from that historical perspective, it is of course true, but I don't call myself Native American, although I am on my mother's side of Mexican Yaqui ancestry. Also, it can be very difficult to learn American culture because it's so quickly changing, it's so rapidly changing. And it also, to some degree, depends upon how old people are when they come here. When you're younger, you're able to learn language much more quickly than if you're somebody who's coming to the United States in your 40s or 50s. And of course, there are lots of stereotypes about immigrants, which of course does create quite a bit of hostility that is generated toward immigrants. And so even if you are someone who does not fit that stereotype at all, it doesn't matter because people will believe what they believe. Okay, so I do want to focus on undocumented immigration. There are many people who call it illegal immigration. I prefer the term undocumented immigration because, again, when I think about how this nation was at least the place that we now call the United States, all the people who came to this continent were undocumented. Okay, and so this whole idea of illegal immigration to me just doesn't sit well. But again, that's my choice of term. You can certainly use the term illegal immigration if you prefer. Of course, undocumented immigration is fairly common in the United States. When we think of undocumented immigration, we tend to think of brown people. We don't think of all the white people who come here and overstay their visas. We don't think of the Australians who come here and overstay their visas, or the Irish, or the British, or anybody from Northern or Western Europe. We do have people in the United States who are undocumented white people, but because they blend in with the majority, with the white population that's here, people don't question their immigration status. Their status here. I just last year, I moved to Reno in December 2019, and last year, it was maybe 4 or 5 months after I'd been here. I was in a place called Carson City, south of Reno, where I live. I'd been coming back from a hike near Tahoe, Lake Tahoe, and my husband and I decided to stop at Costco. And so he had forgotten to bring the bags that we were going to use because, they don't have any bags at Costco. So I was waiting for him near the entrance, and there was a gentleman who was also waiting near the entrance. And so he he struck up a conversation with me. He asked, "Oh, did you forget your Costco card too?" And I said, "No." Um, my husband just went to go get the bags in the car, and he said, "Oh, I'm waiting for my wife. We forgot our Costco card, so you have to get the temporary one." I said, "Yeah, oh yeah, that happens." And then he asked me this out of the blue: "Are you from Mexico?" And I was taken aback by his comment or by his question, and I asked him why. Why was he asking the question? Because I thought it was quite offensive. I didn't ask him if he came from Ireland or Britain or whatever. And so anyway, he said, "Oh, because you look like my ex-wife. I was married to a Mexican woman." And I said, "Well, okay, that still doesn't explain why you are asking if I'm from Mexico." And he said, "Well, it was just a question. I didn't mean to offend you." And so I said, "Okay, well, I'm gonna go and find my husband. Have a good day." I didn't answer his question because it's none of his business, number one. But number two, again, who's going to ask a white person, are you from Britain? Are you from Norway? Are you from Germany? Nobody asks white people if they're from someplace else. And yet people of color, we often are asked where we're from or if we're from some other place. Excuse me. There is a law. Well, it's not a law. It's an act. It's called DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Former President Obama, signed a piece of executive legislation in 2012 that created this DACA program, which enables undocumented children or individuals who were brought to the United States prior to the age of 15 or under, to stay in the United States without fear of deportation. Now, of course, it's not a blanket thing. People have to, each individual has to apply to the program, fill out an application, and hopefully you get granted deferral, which deferral is simply meaning, hey, we're not going to try to deport you because you have this protection of DACA for now. Of course, the unfortunate thing about this is it's not a law. It's an executive order that was signed by President Obama in 2012. So it is a program. It's not a law, which means that, and so that's a misnomer there. It's not a law. That means that there is no pathway to citizenship in this program. It is deferral, meaning that, again, the government's not going to move toward booting you out if you remain in the program and you don't commit any crimes and you go to school and you work. You can actually work legally too under this program. It is an improvement, certainly, over not having deferral. That's why it's called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Unfortunately, because there's no path to citizenship, these are individuals who are living in limbo. And when I was teaching full-time at East LA College and the law first passed, I helped students, because I'm a lawyer, and so I'd help students fill out their paperwork. And some were granted DACA protection, others were not. And one of the young males that I helped fill out his application, very intelligent young cat. He was in Mesa, and he was, planning to go to engineering, transfer to be an engineer, etc. I ran into him several years after that, and he was taking a couple courses. He had transferred to Cal State LA. He was taking a couple courses at ELAC during the summer, and he was getting ready to graduate from Cal State LA, and he wanted to get a PhD in engineering. And I asked him if he had reapplied for DACA, and he said no. But something that he said really struck me as being unfortunate, because we're losing out here, I think. He said he was probably going to immigrate or migrate to Canada because it would be easier for him to migrate to Canada and become a Canadian citizen there, and he could go to school for free there. And so he said, I tried to stay in the U.S., but it's clear that this country has no use for me. And I thought, wow, that's so messed up. That here's this really intelligent young guy. He's done all the right things, and yet he's going to have to leave. That was his feeling. I got to leave and go to a country where it'll be easier for me to become a citizen, and education's free there. Okay, so of course, again, lots of information about DACA in the text. Make sure you read it. One of the paper assignments I'm going to give you, a paper assignment I'm giving you for the chapter is to just write a short paper about your ideas or thoughts about DACA. So make sure to read that part of the text. All right. There's a clip there that I put. It's a recent clip. I think it was just last month. And then I heard again this morning, although I couldn't find the clip, from MSNBC about migrant children reporting poor living conditions. There was a report this morning on MSNBC that there's actually abuse now being reported in some of these detention facilities along the border. And so clearly, the U.S. has some issues with how quickly it processes refugees and asylees, because that's what people who have crossed the border and who have turned themselves into Border Patrol agents are saying. Look, I'm a refugee. A refugee means that you are fleeing some terrible situation in your home country. An asylee is different. That means you are claiming that you need asylum protection from some sort of persecution in your home country. Political persecution or religious persecution are two that quickly come to mind. Or maybe even genocide. Maybe there's genocide that's happening in your home country to people like yourself. So refugees and asylees are different. But again, you clearly have to have an overwhelming reason why you're claiming to be either a refugee or an asylee. And so, of course, those applications take time to process. They do some investigation, etc. But we've got to put people somewhere while all that's happening. And very clearly, there just isn't enough space at these facilities, or maybe there's just not enough as many facilities as are needed, etc. And so clearly, we've got a big problem down at the border, and the government is, for lack of a better word, dysfunctional right now, with both parties engaging in tactics that are not helping the situation. They seem to each want to block each other's efforts at whatever they do. So I think clearly this will continue to be an issue. So that's it for this chapter overview. Please, as always, make sure that you're reading the full chapter.